Richardson said. They were talking through the intercom system built into their flight helmets, but even then they had to nearly yell at each other to hear over the noise the little helicopter made.
"All those colors you see?" "Yeah. That's oil in the water. Most of this area is so thick with it you'll be able to see a film over the water come midday."
Nice, Richardson thought. This area had once been the hub of the oil and gas industry in the United States. Now, all of it was gone. It was no wonder that gas had gone to more than $12 a gallon in the last 2 years.
"You see many people down in this area?" Richardson asked. "You talking about uncles or zombies?" "Either. You see dead bodies every once in a while. You know, floaters. Hardly ever seen anybody alive, though. The water's too deep."
Richardson stole a sideways glance at Michael Barnes, the Gulf Region Quarantine Authority pilot who'd been assigned to fly him around for the next 2 weeks. Barnes was a former Houston police officer, and he still looked the part. He wore a blue flight suit with a black tactical vest over that, his sidearm worn in a jackass rig under his left armpit. He was 38, tall, lean. He never seemed to smile. Richardson had a knack for understanding people. It was why he was so good at writing about how people dealt with disasters. But Barnes was a tough nut to crack. He answered all of Richardson's questions, even the personal ones, with plain-spoken ease. But even still, Richardson sensed a hard grain of meanness in the man that was like a warning not to get too close.
"Hang tight," Barnes said. "I'm going to swing us around and head north toward downtown. I want to show it to you while it's still at high tide so you can see the hand." "What's the hand?" "That's what we call the shape made by the floodplain. Due to elevation and runoff and the tides and all that stuff, the outline of the flooded areas changes throughout the day. If you catch it during high tide, the waters look like an outstretched hand about to grab downtown." "You're joking?" Richardson said. "Nope. You'll see it right away." "How come I've never heard that before?"
Barnes shrugged.
"The powers that be don't like to make a big deal of it. We have a bad enough time with treasure hunters trying to sneak in. I guess they figure it would make our job even harder if we became some sort of tourist attraction."
Richardson nodded. After a moment, Richardson said,
"I was going to ask you about the treasure hunters. What do you think makes people want to risk sneaking in through the quarantine? Is there really that much worth stealing in here?"
"I guess so. You think about it, really, there's probably a fortune down there. I mean, all our banks and museums and jewelry stores and all that. Those places weren't cleaned out before the storms, and as far as I know, they weren't cleaned out afterward. Not with the infected roaming the streets. And with the economy being what it is, can you really blame people for wanting to risk busting the quarantine for some potentially huge profits?"
"No, I guess not. Hell, even in good times, just the rumor of treasure is enough for some folks."
Richardson looked down again. They were passing over some kind of refinery now, pipes and trucks and mangled debris visible through the water.
"You're not thinking of going in with some of the treasure hunters, are you?"
Richardson smiled sheepishly. He was never very good at concealing what he was thinking.
"The thought had occurred to me."
"Well, don't think about it too hard," Barnes said. "I mean, you're a nice guy and all, but if I see you trying to come through the quarantine wall some night, I'll shoot you in the head, same as anybody else." He said it breezily enough, but there was still something there that made it pretty plain he wasn't joking.
"Point taken,"
Richardson said. The helicopter's engine hiccuped, and they lost altitude momentarily as Barnes wrestled with the controls. Richardson's stomach went halfway up his throat.
"What the hell was that?"
"Nothing to it," Barnes said. His voice was glassy smooth.
"These old Schweitzers, they're finicky." "Are we okay?"
"Yeah, we're fine. Don't worry about it." Richardson looked doubtful. The helicopter ride was scarier than he thought it would be, and it occurred to him that it wouldn't take more than a strong wind to hurl the thing to the ground.
Where'd these bullet holes come from?
Barnes glanced at the holes.
The uncles. They shoot at you?
Sometimes.
Richardson groaned. That doesn't make me feel any better.
It's no big deal, Barnes said.
Here, look down over there. I want you to see this. Whenever I come through here, I always try to find some dolphins. Dolphins?
Barnes pointed through the cockpit bubble to the water below. Richardson leaned over to see. They were flying over what had once been I-45, the street lamps and overhead road signs just poking up through the water. Barnes dropped the altitude even lower and cut their airspeed to a crawl. From a height of some 60 feet or so, Richardson could look through the fairly clear water and see the cars and debris down at road level.
You see 'em?
Barnes said. Richardson scanned the water for a long moment before he saw what Barnes was trying to show him. There were dolphins down there, 3 of them. They were headed northbound, toward downtown, paralleling the freeway below them. Richardson guessed the water was between 15 and 20 feet deep, just deep enough for the animals to skim over the roofs of the sunken cars and still stay submerged. They almost looked like motorcycles zipping through traffic.
That's amazing.
Yeah, Barnes agreed.
There aren't many perks to this job, but that's one of them.
Richardson watched the dolphins until they finally turned off and swam into the deeper water east of town. They were getting closer to Houston proper now, and seeing larger and larger buildings, the ground-level floors flooded to the ceilings. Richardson crinkled his nose.
Hey, you smell that?
Barnes looked aft and cursed under his breath. Richardson turned around in his seat, as much as his seatbelt would allow, and saw a long, thick cloud of brown smoke trailing out behind them.
Holy shit, are we on fire?
No, we're not on fire, Barnes said. He sounded annoyed.
The smoke is brown. We're burning oil. The smoke from a fire would be dark black.
Barnes turned back to his controls and started checking gauges.
Are we going down?
We're fine, he said, a bit peevishly.
Just keep quiet and don't touch anything.
Barnes keyed his radio and said,
Quarter 4-1 to dispatch.
Go ahead, Quarter 4-1, said a woman's voice.
Quarter 4-1, we're losing oil pressure. I'm smoking pretty bad. I'm going to try to get us back to Katy Field.
There was a pause on the dispatcher's end that Richardson didn't much like.
10-4,
the dispatcher said at last.
What's your location, Quarter 4-1? Quarter 4-1, we're over Bay Area Boulevard and El Camino Real. You have any other units in the area?
Negative, Quarter 4-1. There was a pause on Barnes's end that Richardson liked even less than the dispatcher's.
10-4,
Barnes said.
Quarter 4-1, be advised. I have Katy Field standing by for your approach.
10-4, Barnes said. Richardson watched Barnes's hands flying over the controls. He had no idea what the pilot was doing, but he could tell plain enough that they were in some serious trouble.
Officer Barnes?
Shut up. Several tense moments went by. Barnes continued to work the controls. A terrible acid fear spread through Richardson's gut as the engine continued to sputter and smoke. Despite Barnes's best efforts, they were losing altitude, and their airspeed was slipping. The engine sputtered once more, and smoke began to pour into the cockpit. Warning lights lit up all across the control panel.
Quarter 4-1, we're going down. Repeat, we're going down. Coming up on El Dorado and Galveston Road.
Richardson didn't hear a reply. The helicopter shook beneath him, and the next moment they were going down way too fast, coming up on a large grouping of trees and some overhead power lines.
Hang on,
Barnes said. They hit the water with a hard smack that knocked the air from Richardson's lungs and threw his whole world forward like he was caught on the crest of a wave. The blades of the helicopter's props struck the water with a series of loud slaps before they snapped completely free of the fuselage. The control panel sparked, and for a moment there was so much smoke that Richardson couldn't see. Then, Water started to pour over his legs. He screamed. He felt hands groping at his chest. He tried batting them away, but couldn't.
"Stop it!" Barnes ordered him. "I'm trying to get you loose."
And a moment later, Richardson felt himself coming out of his seat, strong arms pulling him across the cockpit of the helicopter and into cold water that came up to his waist. He coughed and tried to rub the acrid smoke from his eyes. The water in his mouth tasted nasty, oily. "Are you okay?" Barnes asked. Gradually, Richardson's vision cleared. He looked at the officer and nodded. Barnes turned on the helicopter and then punched it.
"Fucking piece of shit," he said. "Goddamn worthless fucking piece of shit!"
Richardson was still too stunned to take in the fact that he had just lived through a helicopter crash. It was all he could do to stand on his own 2 feet. Barnes, meanwhile, was digging through the cockpit for the emergency kit and his AR-15. He came up with an orange backpack and 2 rifles. He came over to Richardson and stuck one of the rifles into his hands.
"You know how to use that?"
Richardson took hold of the rifle, gripping it like they'd taught him in the Army 20 years earlier. He nodded.
"Good," Barnes said, "because we're about to have company."
Only then did Richardson get a sense of their surroundings. They had landed in what looked like a grocery store parking lot. He could see the tops of cars and trucks just rising above the water. Off to their right was a subdivision, the houses sagging in on themselves, empty black holes where the windows and doors had been. There was movement all around them.
"The noise of the crash," he thought. "It'll be like a beacon for the infected."
Ragged shapes that hardly looked like people anymore stumbled into the water from the subdivision, filling the air with the sounds of their splashing and their moaning. He looked down at the gun in his hands, then at Barnes.
"Let's move out," Barnes said. "We're on the clock now."
Chapter 5. Art Waller was 84 years old and suffering from the classic 1-2 punch of gastrointestinal nuisances that nature so generously doles out to the elderly: a fixed hiatus hernia and a peptic ulcer. Add to that 2 bad knees, a back that screamed at him every time he had to reach below his thighs, and a palsied shake that he was pretty sure was the advance calling card of Parkinson's, and his life was basically an object lesson in misery. Still, for all that, right now he had no intention of giving it up. He turned slightly, just enough to see that the thing behind him was still gaining. Art needed a walker to get around. The tennis balls on its legs softened the noise, but the contraption still clanked each time he put his weight on it. Clank, 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 clank. He was creeping along, but it was as fast as he could go. He chanced another look at his pursuer. There, on the sidewalk, less than 10 feet behind him now, was one of the infected. It shouldn't be here. They were supposed to be quarantined. He had seen them on TV, and they had said they were all locked up behind the wall. It shouldn't be here. But it was, and it was about to catch him. The zombie used to be a nurse here at the Springfield Adult Living Village, but she was nothing but a mess now. No legs. They'd been torn off below her thigh. Now she was pulling herself along on her belly with raw, bloody, mostly fingerless stubs that had once been her hands, leaving a thick, blackish-red snail trail behind her. And she was getting closer. He gasped. The sound came up inside him like the rattle of dried beans in a coffee can. He was ashamed at the weakness he heard there, angry at himself. Damn it, he'd fought in Korea. Now, this miserable body of his was moving like the hour hand on a clock. And that zombie behind him, she was the minute hand. It was a slow-motion pursuit, but she was going to catch him. It was just a matter of time. Clank, 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 clank. He tried a few doors, but it was the 4th of July weekend, and there was almost nobody left here at the village. Just a skeleton crew of staff and a few residents. He tried another door.
"Help me!"
he cried.
"Please!"
Behind him, the thing crawling on the sidewalk began to moan. The sound of it unhinged something inside him. Union troops, he remembered, waiting on one knee in some cornfield someplace, their rifles ready at their cheeks, told stories of hearing the Confederates coming toward them, the rebel yell echoing off the surrounding hillsides. It did something to you deep in your bowels, they said. Rattled you. This was infinitely worse. He tried to go faster. Clank, 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 clank. Just ahead there was a hallway. He could hear voices. A man's deep voice, a woman's laughter. The man's voice again.
"Ed Moore," he
thought.
"the retired U.S. Deputy Marshal. Help me,"
he said.
"Ed."
He put everything he had into it. Clank, 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 clank. Ed Moore had moved to Florida back in February because he liked the weather. For 11 years after his retirement from the U.S. Marshals Service, he'd lived in Amarillo, the Texas Panhandle, where the winters were an endless parade of icy sleet and gray skies and wind that never stopped howling. Compared to that, Florida, with its comfy little villas nestled among the bougainvillea and palm trees, and the live-in staff who wandered the place in their golf carts, was an absolute paradise. The woman, Julie Carnes, was new to the Springfield community. She'd moved in at the end of June. She'd caught his attention right off. Slender, a pretty face. Not handsome, but pretty. Still wore her hair long. He liked that. He leaned against the doorway to her private cottage and tipped his cowboy hat to her through the screen door. Ed said he thought it was time he introduced himself. She was knitting something. She folded the needles together and rested them on the lap of her white dress. He was wearing loose, faded blue jeans, black boots, a clean white shirt open at the neck. He doffed his cowboy hat to her as he entered, exposing a thick, uncombed tangle of white hair before sliding the hat back onto his head. There was a weather-worn look about him, like he should be trailing a cloud of dust. She said, "You the resident cowboy?" He smiled. He didn't mind smiling. He still had all his own teeth. "You're just like I figured," he said. "Oh? And what did you figure?" "Well, I figured I'd found somebody I could talk to." "How do you know you can talk to me?" "Well," he said, "I ain't never seen you in purple. I hate purple on a woman. All the women around here, they wear purple like it's some kind of uniform." "You mean an old lady uniform?" "I'm 75 years old, Mr. Moore. I don't need a uniform for people to know I'm an old crone." "You ain't a crone," he said. "You want to know the truth? I think you're about the best-looking woman in this place. I mean that. I'm talking about the staff, too. And by the way, you can call me Ed." She nodded. There was a lull. "So, you're here by yourself?" she said. "For the last 6 years." "You've been here 6 years?" "I've been here since February. I've been on my own 6 years." "Ah," she said. 2 years for me." "You get lonely?" She shrugged. "Sometimes. A girl can knit only so many scarves. Why? You asking me out?" "Jerry Jeff Walker's going to be in Tampa next Friday." She laughed. "I knew it. A cowboy. The hat isn't just for show, is it?" "Been wearing it all my life. Don't see any reason to give it up now." "You mean now that you're not a marshal anymore?" "How'd you know about that?" She looked down at her knitting needles, fidgeted with them. "I asked around about you," she said. He thought he saw a blush, but that might have been the light. Encouraged, he said, "They don't have cowboys where you come from?" "I'm from Monroeville, Pennsylvania. They got George Romero, and that's about it." "Ah." "You like living here?" she asked.
It's okay. Actually, to tell you the truth, not as much as I thought I would. I don't play golf, and I don't read like I planned on doing. Most of these other guys here, they sit around all day and watch the news and talk about how much better things were when Ronald Reagan was in office. Makes me want to pull my hair out.
So what do you do? She asked. Sit around with them and wait for something to happen?
Well, I had kind of thought that something just did happen. She blushed that time. He was sure of it. He was about to ask her if she wanted to come back to his place for a drink when they heard panting outside the door.
"Help me,"
came a man's voice.
"Ed."
Julie looked at Ed. He frowned. He went to the screen door and poked his head out, a silhouette standing there in the sunshine. "Art? What's wrong there, buddy?"
"The nurse," he panted. "Out there. She's infected. Oh, Jesus, after me. Ed, please help me."
"Hold on there, Art. I'll help you." He turned to Julie. "You mind if I bring him in here?"
"Of course not," she said, and rose from her chair and started clearing skeins of yarn and magazines from a couch in the living room.
They sat Art down on the couch, the two of them lowering him into his seat, even as he went on frantically babbling about something going on outside in the hallway.
"What happened to him?"
Julie asked. Ed shook his head.
"Out there,"
Art said. He was gasping.
"She's out there."
"Who's out there?"
"The nurse. She doesn't have any legs."
"What?"
"Ed,"
Julie said. She looked frightened. "I'll go check it out. You stay here with him." He slid out the door and stood there for a moment, looking around, then headed off in the direction from which Art Waller had come. The hallway was empty, quiet, checkerboarded with patches of sunlight and shadow. But Ed could still feel the hairs standing up on the back of his neck. Something felt wrong. Back in 1992, he'd gone into a house in Hugo, Oklahoma, with an arrest warrant for a militant white supremacy nut accused of a church bombing that killed 2 black women. The house had looked empty, but Ed wasn't so sure. All his internal alarms were blaring. He'd stepped into a back bedroom, and something told him to stop. Looking down, he saw a tripwire under his foot that led up the door jamb to a shotgun mounted in the ceiling. Another inch, and they'd have been cleaning him up off the floor with a sponge and some hot, soapy water. He had that same feeling now. Moving slowly, he stepped up to the corner of the hallway and looked around. He saw a long, dark smear of blood on the sidewalk. The trail turned into a room a few doors up the walk. He glanced behind him and saw Julie standing in the doorway, watching him. He motioned her back inside. Then he set off toward the blood trail. The door was propped open, and inside he saw 2 paramedics and Art Waller's legless nurse feeding on the body of a supine woman, her torso ripped open like a canoe. The body shook and twitched as the zombies tore into her. Ed nearly vomited. 3 blood-smeared faces looked up at him. Ed backed away. One of the zombies, a tall, slender kid in his 20s, whose only injury seemed to be a small but festering wound on his shoulder, got to his feet. The next moment he was running at Ed.
Fast mover,
Ed thought. But before he could react, the thing had closed the distance between them. The zombie raised its hands for Ed, and Ed sidestepped him, coming up behind him and pushing him headlong as he swept his feet out from under him. The zombie crashed headfirst into a bougainvillea bush and got wrapped up inside its dense inner branches. When Ed turned back to the cottage, the second paramedic was already on his feet and limping more slowly than the first toward him. The legless nurse was dragging herself toward him on her belly. He stepped out of the doorway and almost ran down the hallway to Julie's cottage. But he stopped when he realized the zombies would follow him. He couldn't lead them straight to Julie and Art. He looked around for a way out. The first zombie, the fast mover,
was pulling himself out of the tangled bougainvillea. The second one stepped out of the doorway, and now he could hear their moans. The sound carried through the courtyard, and it made his blood run cold. Without a plan, he took off running across the courtyard, away from Julie's cottage. They were still behind him, but he had a pretty good lead. A few quick turns, and he lost them somewhere near the path that led down to Tamiami Road and Centennial Park. And that's when he heard voices. One voice, actually. A woman's.
"It was such a lovely wedding," he heard her say. "Your daddy was so proud. I remember watching the two of you come down that aisle, you holding onto his arm, just smiling ear to ear. I think it was the only time I ever saw him cry."
Ed followed the woman's voice. It belonged to Barbie Denkins, whose husband had died 30 years earlier and left her obscenely rich. The woman was in her late 80s now and thoroughly senile. Alzheimer's. Her cottage door was standing open. There was blood on the doorframe. Inside, her quarters were packed with unopened boxes of sporting goods and picture frames and vegetable juicers and miracle cleaning products. All of it sold to her by unscrupulous telemarketers she was too starved for attention to hang up on. Off in a far corner of the room, a zombie was bumping into boxes, trying to fight its way to where Barbie Denkins sat, chattering happily away.
"You didn't want those red flowers on your cake," Barbie said, "but I went ahead and did it just the same, and it was a better cake for it. You tell me it wasn't."
The zombie saw Ed and turned his way. Beside Ed, next to the door, was an umbrella and a wooden Louisville Slugger baseball bat. He picked up the bat. The zombie stepped around a row of boxes, its head leaning to one side at an unnatural-looking angle. One of its cheeks had been torn open so that the mouth was elongated, the blood-stained rows of its teeth visible all the way back to the molars. It moaned as it raised its hands at him. Ed took a step forward and swung for the fence, planting the sweet spot of the bat on the side of the zombie's head. The thing went tumbling backward against the wall, then landed in a heap on the floor. It didn't move. There was a pain in Ed's left shoulder, and he worked it around in the socket. The joints were protesting the sudden exertion. "Stay here," he said to Barbie. Outside her door, the first of the two paramedics was coming around the corner about 50 feet away. The second one wouldn't be far behind. He flexed his shoulder once again and raised the bat for another blow. He'd take care of these two, then go back inside and get Barbie. Piece of cake. Chapter 6.
"What are we going to do?"
Richardson asked. He was following Michael Barnes as best he could, wading through water that looked like melted caramel, holding his AR-15 up above his shoulders to keep it from getting wet.
"Be quiet," Barnes ordered him. "I'm going to get us to a secure position. A roof, if possible. From there, we're going to call for extraction."
"They'll extract us? You're sure?"
Barnes put a finger to his lips. Then, using hand gestures, he indicated that they were going to go around the back of the grocery store and into the buildings behind it. They couldn't use the roof of the grocery store. Richardson knew that. Scared as he was, he'd been able to tell from the air that the building's roof had collapsed in on itself. It wouldn't be safe. He turned and looked back at the wreckage of the helicopter. The thing looked like the jumbled exoskeleton of some enormous insect. A thick column of smoke rose into the air. Beyond the wreckage, he could see the infected already coming into the area. They were attracted to noise. All their senses worked, but their sense of hearing was the strongest, and the moaning of those already in the area would only make things worse. He'd read Eddie Hudson's book about the first night of the outbreak in San Antonio, and like a lot of others had, he found it hard to believe that so many of the infected could pour into a street that was completely empty only moments before. But after seeing it for himself, he knew it was true. Michael Barnes clearly knew it too. Like all members of the Gulf Region Quarantine Authority, Barnes was a graduate of the Shreveport Survival School. Richardson had interviewed some of its instructors, and had even been through an abbreviated version of the program before being allowed to go inside the quarantine zone with GRQA agents. He had a sense of what Barnes was trying to do by guiding them against the side wall of the grocery store. Richardson was ready for the slow but steady pace of their advance. Stay quiet, stop, listen, scan, and move out again. While at the Shreveport school, he had felt like a kid playing cops and robbers. But this was the real deal. Ahead of him, Barnes stopped and looked around. He motioned for Richardson to come forward. "When we go around this corner, we're not going to stop, okay? You'll see a strip center just ahead of you. We're going to stay to the right of that. You got me?"
"Yeah,"
Richardson said. "That weapon you've got there can fire through a magazine in a hurry, so don't lose your cool and empty the whole thing into the first zombie you see. Every shot counts, or you don't take it." Richardson nodded. "Okay, let's go." Barnes stepped around the corner, and Richardson tucked in right behind him. Ahead of them was a long stretch of water, the strip mall Barnes had told him about on the opposite side. In between, a few cars were sunken up to their windshields. Here and there they saw a tree. Richardson counted 16 zombies, all of them within 50 yards of their position, and closing fast. "Let's go," Barnes said. He was already moving out, going quickly but without splashing. It was harder for Richardson. He was terrified of moving through water, especially when he couldn't see his feet. He had a terrible feeling that the infected were just below the surface, waiting to grab him, even though he knew that to be impossible. The infected weren't truly dead, after all. They needed to breathe to go on hunting. As they were moving forward, he tripped over the curb of a traffic island and went face first into the water. When he came up, spluttering and blinking the water from his eyes, he saw that Barnes was already a good 10 yards ahead of him. He ran forward, making a terrific splash. But Barnes didn't try to quiet him. One of the zombies had closed the distance between them, and Barnes leveled his AR-15 and dropped him with one shot. 2 others were close by, and he dropped them as well. The pools of blood spreading out around the dead zombies turned green as they sank. Barnes turned back to Richardson and said, "Heads up, behind you." Richardson twisted around. A male zombie, the face a blotchy pattern of scabs and abscessed wounds, was less than 10 feet from him. He hadn't heard it moving behind him, he realized. And then another thought occurred to him. This was one of the later stage zombies. It didn't move with the same clumsy gait. The milky film had cleared from its eyes. The dead, vacant stare was gone. In its place was a feral intensity, the deliberateness of a hunter. "Shoot it!" Barnes ordered. Richardson muttered an acknowledgment and raised his rifle and fired. His first shot hit the zombie in the neck and sent it spiraling backward into the water. Richardson got it in the head with his second shot. He heard firing behind him. Barnes had zombies on 3 sides, but he was still calm. His firing was controlled, his pattern deliberate. One after another the zombies went down until only a few remained, and those farther off not yet a threat. The battle had lasted perhaps 20 seconds, but Barnes had managed to drop a dozen or more of the infected. Richardson was in awe. "Be careful," Barnes said. "Don't get too close to them. They may look dead, but it's always possible for one of them to pop up suddenly." Richardson nodded. "Come on, let's go." Barnes led him to a 5-story building a couple hundred yards away. All the windows and doors had been blasted inward during the storms, and the first floor was choked with debris, lath visible through the walls. Water came up to the bottom of the few pictures still on the walls, and lapped to the top of the receptionist's counter toward the back. "Come on," Barnes said. "We're headed for the roof." They found the stairs and started up, water pouring out of their flight suits as they moved up to the second floor. Richardson stayed behind Barnes, letting him make sure the way was clear before they proceeded upward again. Every floor was a repeat of the one below it. Wrecked, the walls peeling, the carpet dark and moldy beneath their boots. The place smelled of seawater and sewage and rot. When they reached the roof, Barnes moved immediately to the edge and looked down. Richardson moved in beside him. Below, a few zombies were moving toward the fallen corpses. Richardson knew that these later-stage zombies were cannibals and wouldn't hesitate at an easy meal. He was watching one pack of zombies eating a floating corpse when all of a sudden the corpse was yanked under the water. One of the zombies refused to let go of his meal and was pulled down with it. He resurfaced about 20 feet away, but with one arm bitten off at the elbow.
"What the hell was that?"
Richardson said. Barnes watched the zombie get to its feet and just stand there with a vacant expression on its face. A moment later, it was pulled under again.
"What's down there?"
"Tiger shark, probably."
"A tiger shark? You're kidding."
"They've been known to come in this far during high tide," Barnes said, "and we did put a lot of blood in the water." He stood up then and took the radio from his tactical vest. "Quarter 4-1 to dispatch," he said.
"Go ahead, quarter 4-1.
"Quarter 4-1. We've set up on the roof of the Clear Lake Title Office. Our situation is stable at present, no injuries. Request evac ASAP." There was a long pause. "Quarter 4-1, Barnes said.
"We read you, quarter 4-1. Negative on your request. Evac is not possible from your current location."
Barnes looked at Richardson and frowned. "What the fuck?" he said. He keyed up his radio again. "Quarter 4-1, you did copy my transmission, didn't you? Our situation is stable, but urgent. We are not injured. We need immediate evac." The radio was silent. Barnes tried again, but got nothing. "Fuck," he said, and clipped his radio back onto his tactical vest.
"What does that mean?"
Richardson said.
"Why won't they answer you?"
"What the fuck do you think it means?" Barnes sat down against an air duct and took a Snickers bar from his vest. "Might as well get comfortable," he said. "We're not going anywhere for a while." Chapter 7. Her grandkids said they wanted to get down to the estuary, and Margaret O'Brien figured, sure, that'd be okay. She had them for the weekend while Grace, her daughter, was on a business trip in Atlanta, and frankly she thought she was doing pretty well. The kids fought and bickered with each other every chance they got, that was true, and Randy, who was 7, tattled constantly on his sister Brittany, who was 10. But the trick to kids was just to keep them occupied. They had something to do, they behaved. Grace acted like Margaret had forgotten everything about children. She'd raised $3, hadn't she? And she'd done it as a young widow, too. She didn't have a wealthy ex-husband paying her alimony. She hadn't forgotten everything she'd learned about raising kids. She was 68, sure, but she wasn't senile. Not yet, anyway.
"Look, Ma, I'm not saying you forgot anything,"
Grace had said, once again holding out the book she'd been trying to unload on her for the last 20 minutes.
"All I'm saying is—"
Margaret held up one of her small, chubby hands. "Don't," she said. Margaret, short, thick about the middle, with a generous bust and a full head of brown hair that was only now starting to turn gray, was born Margaret Stephanides, and sometimes, when she argued with her daughters, the Greek blood in her fanned hot. She took one look at the book, Siblings Without Rivalries, it was called, and said, "This is the book you think is going to teach me about taking care of children? Bah! Grace, you're going away for the 3 days. You don't think I can handle myself for 3 days? What do you think, I'm going to let them steal a car or something?" "No, Ma, I just—" The palm again. "You keep your book, Grace. You leave me the kids. Have a good time in Atlanta, okay?" And so there'd been a few fights, sure, and Randy, he looked mystified when Margaret told him to stop tattling instead of yelling at his sister for calling him a turd brain. But it was okay. She was doing fine. Now they were on the way down to the estuary, where the pamphlet up at the nurse's office said they had over 60 species of migrating birds during the summer months, the path lined by bougainvillea and palmettos swaying in the warm ocean breeze. Brittany, who was tall and skinny and beautiful like her mother, liked birds. Randy, he didn't. He looked bored.
"Nana," he said, "where are all the birds? You said there'd be birds."
That was a good point, Margaret thought. She didn't see any.
"Nana, what's that man doing?" "What man, Randy?" "That one."
With her thumb, she pushed a pair of bifocals up the bridge of her nose and leaned forward, trying to see where Randy was pointing. What followed was a moment of confusion. Her mind gave her a merciful sort of reprieve from the shock of too sudden a revelation. Like bad news, the full impact of what she was seeing took a moment to filter through the buffer of her disbelief. But gradually, the obvious could not be denied. That man, she realized, was a zombie.
"Nana?"
She grabbed them both by the shoulder and squeezed. "Come on, kids, let's go back."
"Nana!"
Brittany said. She shook herself loose. Together, they watched the man in orange as he stood up and slowly turned around. His face was covered with blood. Something long and limp, like wet, raw bacon, was hanging from his mouth. Even at this distance, Margaret could tell there was something wrong with the man's eyes. The man in orange climbed onto the bank, pond water leaking out from between his cracked teeth. None of them saw the others coming out of the trees farther down the path. Not until Randy heard sirens from the main road and turned that way.
"Nana!"
he said, pulling on Margaret's shirt. Margaret pulled him close to her. A man in a blood-stained T-shirt and khaki shorts was coming toward them through the grass. A big piece of meat was missing from the side of his face, and dried blood covered his hands. The hands kept opening and closing, like he was begging for food. His mouth opened, revealing teeth black with blood, and he began to moan. The sound was answered all around by the other zombies.
"Nana!"
Brittany shouted. It was too much for Randy. He was pulling against Margaret's grip, trying to run away. Randy was small for his age, but God, he was strong, and he nearly pulled her down with his struggles. And then Ed Moore, wearing a cowboy hat and jeans and holding a baseball bat, stepped into the grass in front of them, and Margaret couldn't believe how fast he moved. He planted the bat right up against the zombie's head. Laid him out with one swing. The zombie didn't get up. Ed stood over the body, looking down. Blood dripped from the end of the bat. Then he turned and smiled, and tipped his cowboy hat to Margaret, winking at her. "How you doing, Margaret? You okay?" Margaret whimpered. Beside her, Randy, who was thoroughly awestruck, just nodded. Ed Moore looked the three of them over. Margaret O'Brien was 68, frumpy, a little overweight, but still confident on her feet. The kids looked young, early elementary school aged. One look at Margaret and he knew she had already figured out what was going on. That was good. Having to explain it to her would take too long. The kids he wasn't so sure about. That age, did they know about the infected? Did they have any idea what it meant to see them outside the quarantine zone? "We have to get somewhere safe," he said. Margaret O'Brien nodded. The kids didn't say anything, just latched onto Margaret and stared at the infected coming at them from all sides. "My cottage is over there," he said, pointing with the bat over their shoulders. "Can you guys make it?" Margaret pulled the children close. Ed figured that was answer enough. He turned and gauged the distance to his cottage. There were 3 zombies between them and safety. 2 others that might be able to close the distance if he didn't get the other 3 with the first hit. "Let's go," he said. And with that, he went for the zombie nearest to them and got behind it. He stroked it in the back of the knees and dropped it. While it was down, he hit it in the back of the head. He gave a quick look behind him. saw that Margaret and her 2 grandkids were still with him, and went on to the next one.
"Where did they come from?"
Margaret asked him. They were in his cottage now. Margaret was standing in the middle of his living room. The children had backed themselves into the corner behind his TV. Neither one of them had said a word since he first met them, and that was okay with Ed. He liked children, always had, but the quieter the better. He figured scared and quiet kids beat scared and crying kids any day.
"Ed?"
He was in his closet, getting his guns down from the storage box on the top shelf. After retirement, he had shelved his beloved .357 revolvers and figured he might never wear them again. And up until today, he had even convinced himself that it was nice not having to carry the things around.
"Ed, where'd they come from? I thought... The quarantine, aren't they... How could this happen?"
He stepped out of the closet with his gun belt in his hand. He slipped it around his waist and buckled it, then put his gun case on the coffee table and took out a pair of Smith & Wesson .357s. He dropped one into the holster and tucked the other into the small of his back. The boy was looking at him, his eyes wide. "I don't know, Margaret. I really don't. It's spreading, though. I saw 3 of them attacking Linda Beard." Margaret looked sick. "Do me a favor," he said. "Check the window. Tell me how many you see."
"Where did you get those guns?"
the boy asked. Margaret was peering through the blinds. She let them fall back into place and said,
"Mr. Moore is a retired U.S. Marshal." "No way! You're a marshal?"
"Used to be," Ed said. He smiled at the boy. "What's your name, son?"
"Randy Hargensen."
"Well, hello, Randy Hargensen. And how about you, little lady?"
"This is Brittany,"
Randy said.
"She's 10.
Ed tipped his hat to her. "Pleased to know you, Brittany." The girl didn't speak. She was trembling all over. Randy said,
"I like your hat. It's cool." "Randy's into westerns,"
Margaret said. "Great. I like a good western myself. You ever read Elmer Kelton, Randy?" The boy cocked his head to one side.
"I'm 7.
"Oh, good point. Tell me, Randy, you ever seen a real marshal's badge?"
"No, sir."
Ed took out his wallet. Inside was a gold badge. He slid it out, removed it from its backer, and then handed it to Randy. "You put that on, okay? You and your sister are going to be my deputies." The boy's smile was huge. The girl was still trembling, though. It was going to take more than trinkets to reach her. "Margaret," he said, "what's the count?"
8 of them,
she said. "Okay, that's no problem." He loaded each of his revolvers in turn from the speed loaders in the gun case. Then he stepped up to the door, a revolver in each hand. "Margaret, come over here and do the door for me. When I tell you to, you throw it open, you hear?"
"Where are we going, Ed?"
"I left Barbie Denkins in her apartment. We're going to go get her. Then we're going to make our way over to Julie Carnes's place. She should still be with Art Waller. From there, I don't know. You ready?" She nodded. He turned and winked at the kids. Then he said, "Okay, throw her open." Margaret opened the door, and Ed rushed outside. There was a zombie right in front of the door, and Ed put a bullet in its forehead. He stepped over the body and went for the others. He didn't waste time letting them come to him. The sound of gunfire would bring more of the infected, and they had to be gone before that happened. Careful to make every shot count, he dropped 5 of them in short order.
"Ed!"
He turned at the sound of Margaret's voice. 2 of the infected had gone for the open door instead of for him. They were on the sidewalk now, one on either side of the door. Ed stepped between them, raised his revolvers, and dropped both zombies simultaneously. When he turned his attention to Margaret and the kids, the boy was looking at him strangely. His eyes were wide, and he wasn't crying. He was smiling.
"Whoa,"
the boy said.
"Mister, that was cool."
Chapter 8. Ben Richardson was looking over the side of the roof at a small group of zombies clustered around the doorway of the building opposite them. There was another group doing the same thing around the door to their building. What exactly they were doing he couldn't tell, but something was going on. It almost looked like they were communicating, discussing something. He and Barnes had spent most of the morning on the roof of the Clear Lake Title Company, waiting for the infected to get bored and wander off. But they hadn't. If anything, there were even more of them down there than before. The sound of their moaning chilled some deep interior part of him, something vital. It hadn't been like this in San Antonio.
"Hey, Officer Barnes."
No answer. Richardson looked back. Barnes was sleeping with his back against the stairwell door, a white hand towel draped over his head. Richardson had heard stories of U-boat captains who sometimes took their boats deep to avoid a depth charging and fell asleep, even as the boat creaked and groaned and shuddered all around them. It was one way to show their men there was nothing to fear, so as to keep up their morale. For a moment, he wondered if Barnes was trying to do something similar now. But just as quickly, he chased the thought away. He didn't get that sense from Barnes. The man had a stoniness to him that didn't seem to allow room for compassion for another man's fear.
"Officer Barnes."
"What do you want?"
"Can you come here for a second, please?"
Barnes lifted the towel, annoyed at having his nap interrupted.
"Please,"
Richardson said, and waved him over. Barnes crawled over to him. "What do you want?" Richardson pointed at the zombies clustered around the doorway across the street.
"Look at them over there," he said. "Why are they doing that?"
The tide was starting to ebb again, and most of the zombies were only up to their knees in water. They were all at a fairly advanced stage in the infection. Their skin was gray and leprous, open sores on their arms and neck and face. But they moved with a confidence that the more freshly turned Stage 1 and Stage 2 zombies couldn't match. Beside him, Barnes studied the crowd. He was frowning. He pulled himself up and peered over the side of the building at the group that was gathering around the door to their own building. "How long have they been there?" he asked.
"I don't know," Richardson said. "I just saw them."
"Shit," Barnes muttered.
"What is it?"
"They're getting ready to make entry," Barnes said. "We're going to have company pretty soon."
"What do you mean? How can you tell?"
Barnes pointed at the zombies out on the street. "I thought you went through the Shreveport school."
"Well,
Barnes cut him off with a wave of his hand. "You see those zombies there? The ones walking there? If you watch them long enough, you'll notice that they're circling the building. The same ones have been doing it all morning, making that god-awful racket. These others have broken away from the main group, though. They've given up trying to flush us out. They're coming in to get us. Those ones over there, they've probably trapped something inside that building. A dog, maybe. There's still lots of dogs around here." Richardson was shocked.
"You're serious? They are capable of that kind of cognition? They can set up a diversion?"
"Of course," Barnes said. "They'll fuck you up if you're not careful. Bubbas like these guys can do basic problem-solving. They can open doors and crawl through windows and hunt in packs. I watched 4 of them trap a raccoon once. I don't know if you ever tried to catch a raccoon, but it ain't easy."
"You call them Bubbas?"
Stage 3 zombies, like those guys. They're not real bright, but they're bright enough to get the job done." Richardson shook his head in amazement. He'd heard rumors that some of the Stage 3 zombies had limited cognition. At Shreveport, they told him some of the more advanced zombies could respond to their names, or cooperate on kills, that kind of thing. But he hadn't believed those rumors. It seemed more like wishful thinking from the growing sector of the American public that wanted the government to go in and try to administer a cure for the necrosis filovirus, even if that meant risking the quarantine. Richardson had seen it before with Dr. Sylvia Carnes's expedition into San Antonio. She'd taken 28 college kids, all of them members of the University of Texas at Austin's chapter of ethical treatment for the infected, into the quarantine zone, and gotten most of them killed in the process. Richardson had been along as an embedded reporter on that disastrous trip, and was one of 3 to make it out of San Antonio alive. It was there he'd solidified his opinion that the infected were beyond help. But seeing the infected like this complicated things.
So what are we going to do?
We're going to need to get out of here. You ready to move? There was a loud crash from somewhere downstairs.
What was that?
Shit, Barnes said. His rifle was leaning against the wall next to the stairwell door. He ran over and picked it up, ejected the magazine, checked it, slapped it back in. How you doing for ammo?
I only fired twice.
Okay, good. Barnes leaned against the door, listening. Even from where he stood, Richardson could hear moans inside the building below them. Something was crashing around inside the stairwell, making its way up. Barnes looked back to Richardson. We're about to get some company. Remember, make your shots count. Don't rock back and start firing, or you'll burn through that magazine in a heartbeat. Richardson nodded. There was a booming crash against the metal door. It rocked against its hinges. Another crash. Next one and they'll be through, Barnes said. Richardson swallowed the lump in his throat and tried to focus. His vision was tunneled around the door. There was a final crash, and the door exploded outward. A zombie stood there, 3 more behind him. The first one lumbered out onto the roof. He looked half-starved. His shirt was little more than a scrap of soiled cotton looped around his neck and his left shoulder. Richardson could count the man's ribs down his right side. They protruded like ripples in a pond through his yellowish-gray, abscessed skin. But his eyes were clear, intent on aggression, full of feral intelligence behind a curtain of wet, dark hair. Richardson's finger twitched against the trigger, but he didn't fire. Barnes did that for him. 4 quick, well-aimed shots. The man looked like he was practicing on the range. He kept himself in a crouch, making every move count. The exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds. Barnes advanced into the doorway without saying a word. Richardson went after him. There was one more zombie in the stairwell, but Barnes put it down with another well-aimed shot. In the stairwell, the sound of the AR-15 was like 2 boards being slapped together. It echoed inside Richardson's head. A moment later, they stepped out onto the 5th floor. From there, they were going to have to take the exposed interior stairwell that led down through the center of the building and into the lobby. Debris had collected all over the floor, and Richardson had to scramble over it just to keep up with Barnes. They were on the 2nd-floor landing when they spotted their next zombie. It crashed out of an office to Richardson's right, and Richardson gasped in surprise as the thing clapped a mangled hand on his shoulder. He ducked away from the woman and spun around, bringing the muzzle of his rifle to bear on the woman's head. He fired, and the woman's head exploded all over the wall behind her. The headless corpse fell backward against the wall and sagged to the ground. Richardson lowered his rifle and looked at the damage he had caused.
My God,
he whispered. But when he turned around, Barnes was out of sight.
Officer Barnes?
He heard the sound of footsteps below him. He looked over the railing and saw Barnes moving in a crouch across the lobby. Realizing that Barnes had no intention of waiting for him, Richard ran down the stairs as fast as the debris in his way allowed. All sorts of trash had floated into the lobby with the ebb and flow of the tides, and scrambling across it was hard. Barnes made it look easy, never letting his weapon dip from the low-ready position. But for Richardson, it was humiliatingly difficult to navigate the mess of chairs and tables and plastic boxes and piles upon piles of plywood that seemed to be everywhere. He came up next to Barnes and looked out into the street. The noise of their firefight had attracted scores of the infected. They stumbled out of every doorway, from around every corner, advancing through the knee-deep water with varying degrees of skill. Some almost seemed to bound through the water. Others moved in fits and starts, like badly handled marionettes. Richardson raised his rifle, but Barnes put a hand on the muzzle and forced it down. "No," he said. "Save your ammo."
"What are we going to do?"
"We're going to move, fast. Come on." They ran up the narrow street, zigzagging through the wreckage, hugging the walls of buildings wherever possible. Richardson kept as close to Barnes as he could, but the man was fast. By the time they reached the corner of the building, Richardson was a good 10 yards behind him, and losing ground. But then Barnes stopped. He peered around the corner, then looked back at Richardson. His gaze didn't stay on Richardson, though. It drifted to the area behind him, and his face took on an odd, puzzled expression. Richardson stopped and turned to see what Barnes was looking at. None of the infected had followed them. They had run right through the crowd, but now the infected were all turning away and forming a tightening ring around a knot of people who had just emerged from the building across the street from the Clear Lake Title Company. Even from a distance of 200 feet or so, Richardson could tell they weren't infected.
"Oh, my God," he said. "Officer Barnes, do you see—"
"Uncles," Barnes said. "Come on." He made a move to duck around the corner.
"Hey, wait," Richardson said. "We have to help them."
"They're uncles," Barnes said. "They're dead already."
"You're kidding. You're just going to leave them? You can't."
"Just fucking watch me." Barnes turned away. Richardson stared at his back, amazed that the man could disengage from the scene so effortlessly. He only had a moment to make up his own mind. Follow Barnes, or do what his gut told him was the only humane thing to do. He went with his gut. While Barnes slipped around the corner, Richardson ran out into the middle of the flooded street and began to scream at the top of his lungs,
"Hey, hey, hey! Over here!"
He jumped up and down, splashing water everywhere. He waved the rifle over his head and shouted some more. From the shadows, Barnes hissed, "What the fuck are you doing?" Richardson glanced at him.
"Help me,"
he said. When he looked back to the street, some of the infected had broken away and were stumbling toward him. Most were still advancing on the small crowd of people. "Fuck it," Richardson said, and charged. Running and shooting was not easy, and Richardson's shots were mostly misses. He burned through his entire magazine in seconds and scored only 4 hits. Now he found himself in the thick of the fight. He grabbed the rifle by the still-hot barrel and used it as a club. A zombie in the remains of a business suit staggered forward. Richardson could see its wide, intensely wild eyes. Dark ropes of saliva oozed from the corners of his mouth and down his neck. As it reached for him, Richardson brought the rifle over his head and slammed it back down again on top of the zombie's skull. The gun sent a painful shudder up his forearms, like he had hit a baseball with the neck of the bat instead of with the sweet spot. But the zombie folded to the ground and went face down into the water. Dark blood oozed from the wound and into the water like a curl of smoke coming up from a pipe. When he looked up, 4 more zombies were right in front of him. The one to the far left looked emaciated to the point she could barely hold her arms up. Her face was dark, the cheeks sunken, and her eyes appeared to protrude oddly from the sockets, like the skin had puckered around them. He flanked her, intending to use her as a barrier between himself and the others. Then he brought up his rifle again and prepared to swing it at the woman's head. He heard gunshots instead. 2 of the zombies behind the emaciated woman dropped. Then the 3rd. Then the woman. Richardson looked toward the sound and saw Barnes strolling almost casually down the center of the street, firing as he advanced, dropping zombies with every shot. He stopped a little forward of Richardson's position and kept on firing. His skill with the rifle was almost beautiful to watch. He was so smooth, every gesture one of complete control, the shots coming like the ticks of a metronome. He shot through his magazine, ejected it, slapped in a fresh one, and with barely a pause went right back to firing. More zombies were coming into the street from all directions.
"They've got us surrounded,"
he yelled to Barnes. Barnes stopped firing just long enough to scan the scene.
"Get them,"
he said, pointing at the crowd of people.
"Where are we going to go?"
Richardson asked.
"Through there,"
Barnes said. He was pointing at a narrow alleyway between two buildings off to his right.
"Hurry,"
he said. Richardson made his way over to the crowd and did a quick count of 11 people, 4 women and 7 men. One of the women was Hispanic, about 40, dressed in clothes so worn and weathered they looked gray, though they had clearly once been some brighter color. Next to her, clinging tightly to her waist, was a scrawny white kid about 14 years old. All of them were armed with makeshift clubs, pieces of rebar, baseball bats, metal pipes. Richardson got a sense right away that the woman with her arm around the 14-year-old boy was the leader of the group, the others seeming to gather behind her.
"I'm Ben Richardson," he said. "We're going to help you. Come with me." "Okay," she said.
Richardson pointed the others through the alleyway. They crossed the street behind Barnes, who fell in behind the group and covered their retreat. The woman moved into the alleyway with confidence, and Richardson realized that she almost certainly knew her way around here. She and her group had probably been living as scavengers in these ruins since the first days of the quarantine. He fell in behind her and let her take the lead. They emerged into a jumble of wreckage, a seemingly endless field of wheels, paint cans, sheets of plywood, refrigerators, TVs, a huge metal frame like the skeleton of an overhead street sign, toppled trees, light poles, cars, the frame to somebody's boat trailer, and a whole profusion of bricks and pillows and mattresses and mud stretched out before them.
"Can we get through that?"
Richardson asked.
"Yeah, through here,"
the woman said. Before they could move out, there was the sound of a scuffle behind them. An infected woman in a blue dress had stepped out of the doorway of the building to their right and fell on one of the group. The man wrestled with the woman for a moment and then managed to toss her to one side. 2 other members of the group stepped up with their makeshift clubs at the ready and battered the infected woman into a motionless pulp with a few well-placed blows.
"Okay,"
the woman leading the group said. The man who had tossed the zombie to the ground nodded. Behind them, Barnes was firing. He paused long enough to shout, "Get moving up there!" and went back to firing.
"This way,"
the woman said. She led them through the maze of debris with surprising ease, pointing out the tricky parts for Richardson to avoid.
"It isn't easy for the infected to get through here," she told Richardson. "They get confused easily."
He nodded. He noticed that even as they threaded through the densest parts of the debris field, she never let go of the boy's hand. 10 minutes later, they were standing in a parking lot, not a zombie in sight. Off to their right were the remains of a shopping mall. Richardson could still read the signs on a few of the buildings.
"Where are we?"
Richardson said to the woman. "South side of Baybrick Mall," Barnes said, coming up behind them. He had a GPS in his hand.
"Thank you for helping us back there," the woman said. "We would have died if you hadn't helped us."
Barnes just grunted, didn't even look at her. She turned to Richardson.
"We saw your helicopter go down. We were going to see if we could help you, but we got caught in that building across the street from you guys."
Barnes moved off from them and took out his radio. Richardson watched him for a moment, then turned to the woman.
"I'm Ben Richardson,"
he said.
"I know," she said. "You said that already."
And then she smiled, and it was a surprisingly pretty smile. Even after 2 years inside the quarantine zone, her teeth looked white and healthy.
"I'm Sandra Tellez," she said.
She put her arm around the boy and said,
"This is Clint Seifer."
The boy didn't speak. His face was lean and dirty, yet his forehead had a thoughtful heaviness to it that left his eyes in shadow. Richardson had always prided himself on his story radar, that gift he had for spotting the people in a crowd whose stories seemed to capture the essence of a disaster. That radar was going full tilt in his head right now, looking at these two. They had a story. He only hoped there'd be time to hear it. A young man was standing next to Clint. He looked to be about 25, though it was hard to tell for the layers of grime on his face. His eyes kept darting to the pouch clipped to Richardson's shoulder. "What's your name?" Richardson asked him.
"Gerald Stevens," he said. "Hey, do you have any food on you?"
His eyes flicked to the pouch again. Yeah," Richardson said. "I think I got a candy bar."
"Can I have it?"
Richardson laughed, though a bit uncomfortably. There was a disturbing urgency in the man's attitude, something that didn't seem quite sane. "Yeah, sure," he said. He unzipped the pouch and removed a Snickers bar and a small bag of smoked almonds. "You want the almonds, too?" The man nodded, and in that moment Richardson had him pegged. He reminded him of that hyperactive weasel from the old Foghorn Leghorn cartoons, and Richardson had a sudden image of the young man with his tongue hanging out of the side of his mouth, his hands dangling limply in front of his thin, spoon-shaped chest, eagerly bouncing on his toes in nervous anticipation of a morsel. "Here you go," he said. The young man, his hair a matted, out-of-control mess, snatched the food away and walked off from the group to devour it. Richardson watched him go, then looked back to Sandra Tellez. She shrugged.
"Things are hard inside here. We eat whenever we can."
"I'm sorry I don't have any more."
"That's okay," she said. "I'm sure you guys didn't plan on crashing."
"No, you're right about that."
"What happened?"
"I'm not really sure what happened. There was a lot of smoke. Officer Barnes over there said something about an oil leak. We lost oil pressure, and the next thing I know, we're crashing into that parking lot."
"You're not part of the GQRA?"
"No," he said. "I'm a freelance journalist. I was doing a piece on the Quarantine Authority when this happened."
"And now you're screwed here with us?"
Richardson laughed. He liked the way she said it, like there was still a part of her capable of appreciating a sick joke. He hadn't expected to find that among the uncles. "And you guys," he said, "what's your story?" She started to tell him when they heard Barnes cussing at his radio. They both turned and watched him throw it down to the pavement, where it shattered. "What's wrong?" Richardson asked. "What the fuck do you think is wrong?" Sandra said.
"They're not coming for you, are they?"
Barnes kicked a piece of the radio, looked off into the distance, and huffed. "No, they're not," he said. She looked at Richardson.
"Looks like you guys really are screwed."
Barnes walked over to the rest of the group and eyed them each in turn. One of the group was standing off from the others, and Barnes's gaze locked on him. Richardson noticed it was the man who had been surprised by the zombie in the alleyway. He was sitting on his haunches, hugging himself, rocking back and forth. His breathing sounded ragged. His face was pale and sweaty. "You," Barnes said, pointing at the man. "Stand up." Barnes advanced through the crowd. Sandra followed him. The man rose painfully to his feet. He kept his left side turned away from the others. "You're infected," Barnes said.
"No, I'm not,"
the man said, but you could hear it in his voice. "Bullshit," Barnes said. He grabbed the man by the shoulder and spun him around. The man had his hand clamped over his bicep, but blood oozed between his fingers and rolled down the back of his hand. "Show me," Barnes said. Sandra came up behind him.
"Rob, are you okay?"
The man's gaze dropped to the ground. He took his hand away, exposing a nasty bite mark that was already showing the first sign of decay. It smelled bad.
"Oh, no,"
Sandra said. Beside her, Barnes drew his pistol.
"Hey,"
Sandra said.
"Hey, wait!"
But she couldn't stop what happened. Barnes leveled the pistol at the man's face. The man put up his hands, and Richardson could see the man's lips starting to form the words, "No, wait." But it was wasted effort. Barnes fired a single shot that took the top of the man's head off and laid him out on his back on the pavement. Then Barnes holstered his weapon with a casualness that suggested he did stuff like this every day.
"What is wrong with you?"
Sandra said. She was practically screaming at him. Her face was pulled tight in a grimace of rage and pain and shock.
"Why did you do that?"
He was infected.
"We have a way of dealing with this," she said.
"You have a cure?" Barnes asked sarcastically.
"No. We have a way of letting somebody take care of themselves when they get infected. We give them the choice of how they want to—"
"I'm not interested," Barnes said. "I'm getting out of here."
"And just how do you intend to do that?"
Sandra asked.
"They're not coming to rescue you."
He ejected his AR-15's magazine, checked it, then slapped it back into place. "I'm not staying inside the quarantine," he said. "I don't care if I have to shoot my way out or not, but I'm not staying inside this city. You people can come along if you want. You can stay here if you want. I don't care. Me, I'm getting out." And with that, he began walking north across the parking lot. Slowly, silently, the others fell in line behind him. Chapter 9. Billy Klein stopped at the corner of a pink stucco wall and glanced inside the entrance to the Springfield Adult Living Village. There was a guard shack about 20 feet in, with gates on either side. Both gates were hanging open.
So where's the guard?
He wondered. Beside him, Tommy Patmore was almost as far gone as the infected that had just escaped.
"I didn't mean to hurt him. Oh, Jesus, I really didn't. God, there was so much blood. So much of it. It got everywhere."
"Shut up,"
Billy said. They had seen only a few cars that entire morning. One was going by them now, and